In the sun-warmed courtyard of Nirona, Potter Lakhan Patwa aligns his clay kulhads just as the first raindrops begin to patter against the stones. As neighbors gather for cardamom chai and fresh bhakri, the gentle rhythm of the monsoon weaves together stories, music, and the quiet comfort of shared company. Drift into this soothing evening where oil lamps glow against the wet earth and the rain lulls a small village into a peaceful slumber. The golden arrangement. The wind pushed two kulhads off their chalk line before Lakhan could stop them. He caught one by the rim, his fingers brushing the rough clay just before it tipped, and set it back down with a precision that belied the clumsiness of the gust. He wiped his palms on the apron tied around his waist, the friction of the fabric against his skin, a familiar comfort. The apron was old cotton, the color of weak tea stained with years of turmeric and soot, and it carried more patches than the cracked village road outside. He smoothed the fabric flat with the same deliberate care he gave the cups, as if ironing out the wrinkles might somehow steady the trembling earth beneath him. The low wooden stand sat in the center of the courtyard, its legs worn smooth by decades of monsoon nights, the wood dark and slick where hands had rested. 12 kulhads waited on it, each one shaped by his father's hands on a wheel that no longer spun, the clay holding the ghost of those calloused fingerprints. They were rough to the touch, their surfaces bearing the powdery dust of the kiln and the subtle imperfections of a craft that refused perfection. He placed the 13th cup down, aligning it with the others in a slow, meditative circle. A breeze lifted from the salt desert, hot and dry, carrying dust motes that danced in the amber light like suspended gold before settling on the whitewashed walls. 2 cups shifted again, nudged by an invisible hand. He realigned them with his fingertips, pressing gently until the rims touched but did not chip, his breath held in his chest until the clay settled. He tilted his head, the motion slight, almost imperceptible, listening. The sound was far away, a dry crackle rolling across the Ran of Kutch like someone dragging a heavy sack of stones over a tin roof. Dry thunder. Not the wet booming kind that arrived with rain, but the brittle warning kind that spoke of heat and static. He tapped 2 fingers on the rim of the nearest kulhad. The clay was still warm from the afternoon sun, holding a trace of heat like a fading memory of a fever. Satisfied, he moved to the next cup, then the next, tapping each one in turn, a silent roll call of vessels waiting to be filled. Lakhan hummed as he worked, a low, rhythmic tune that matched the beat of his tapping, the vibration humming in his chest. The tune had no words, just a steady rise and fall, like steam escaping a kettle, a sound that belonged to the kitchen and the comfort of waiting. His breath was soft, barely audible over the wind that moaned through the neem branches. The golden light from the setting sun touched the whitewashed walls, turning them the color of old bone, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched toward the empty bench. He glanced toward the neem tree at the far end of the courtyard. The bench beneath it was empty. Bapu would come later, when the rain actually started, not before. The old man had a respect for timing that Lakhan was still learning to emulate. Lakhan sighed, a quiet exhalation that faded into the dust, carrying with it the weight of a solitude he had long since made peace with. He wiped his apron once more, though it was already clean, a nervous tick he couldn't suppress, and stepped back from the stand. 12 kulhads in a circle, one in the center, all waiting like a congregation of small clay saints. He admired the arrangement for a moment, his gaze tracing the imperfect circle, then turned toward the edge of the courtyard. Beyond the low wall, the village lanes stretched toward the salt desert, and the sky had turned the color of wet slate, heavy and bruised. Clouds gathered over the Ran, moving with a sluggish, deliberate grace. Lakhan whispered a single word in Gujarati, saber. Patience. The wind snatched it from his lips before it could take root. The thunder cracked again, closer this time, the sound sharper, tearing through the humid air. Lakhan returned to the stand and adjusted one last kulhad, his fingers gentle on the clay, sensing the vibration of the storm in the ground. He moved toward the brass kettle on the counter, shielding it with one hand as if protecting it from the approaching tempest. The kettle was empty now, its surface dull in the fading light, a hollow promise. He tilted his head again, listening to the shift in the wind. The scent of dust was gone, replaced by something wet and green, the primal smell of rain hitting dry earth, of rain smell rising to meet the sky. A rustle came from beyond the courtyard wall, faint but distinct against the growing roar of the wind. Lakhan paused mid-step, his hand still resting on the cool brass of the kettle. He smiled softly, the corners of his eyes crinkling, a knowing look that suggested he had been expecting this all along. The first visitor was near. He returned to the kettle and struck a match against the side of the counter, the sulfur flare bright in the dimming room. The flame caught, blue at the base, orange at the tip, hungry and alive. He fed it with kindling, then added the larger sticks, building the fire slowly, layer by layer, until the water would soon sing. The golden light faded to amber, then to the gray of twilight, the courtyard dissolving into shades of charcoal and indigo. Lakhan stood beside the stand, wiping his hands one final time, his eyes fixed on the path where the first guest would appear. He tapped a kulhad rim gently with 2 fingers, checking its warmth one last time. The wind shifted again, carrying the promise of monsoon closer with every breath, the air thick enough to taste. From the lane beyond the wall, a sound approached, the soft shuffle of footsteps on dust and the rustle of cloth brushing against thorny bushes. Lakhan did not turn. He waited, his hand resting on the rim of the central kulhad, feeling the clay's coolness seep into his palm. The footsteps stopped. A shadow fell across the courtyard entrance, tall and familiar. "Saber," the shadow said, the word a greeting and a benediction all at once. Lakhan turned to find Wajiha Qureshi standing there, a basket of bhakri wrapped in cloth balanced on her hip, her sari damp at the hem. "The rain is coming, Lakhan. I brought the bread warm." She smiled with her eyes first, the warmth reaching them before her mouth caught up, and she adjusted the cloth covering her basket with a practiced grace. Lakhan nodded, his hand still on the kulhad, feeling the vibration of her voice in the still air. "The cups are ready," he said, his own voice low and steady. "The chai will match the rain." Or the rising steam. The match flared sulphur bright between Lakhan Patwa's calloused fingers, a sudden star in the gathering gray of twilight. The wind, a restless thing that had been prowling the courtyard all afternoon, tried to swallow the flame before it could kiss the kindling. Lakhan cupped his palm around the tiny fire, shielding it with the instinctive tenderness of a mother guarding a chick from a hawk's shadow. His indigo apron brushed his thighs as he crouched beside the brass kettle stand, the metal gleaming dull and heavy in the failing light. The flame licked at the dry twigs, burning blue at the base where the heat was fiercest, trembling orange at the tip where the draft toyed with it. Lakhan did not flinch, he did not rush. The wind could rage, the flame would steady. It always did. Patience was not a virtue he had learned, it was a rhythm he had been born inside. When the fire finally caught, when the kindling crackled into a proper roar and the larger sticks beneath the kettle began to glow with a deep cherry-red heat, Lakhan reached for the small clay jar resting on the stone counter. He lifted the lid, inhaling the sharp, sweet dust trapped inside. Cardamom pods, green and tight as closed fists, and a pinch of cinnamon bark, rough and brown as old earth. He dropped them into the water within the kettle with a sound like small stones falling into a deep well. Almost immediately, steam began to rise, curling into the cooling air in gentle spirals that twisted and dissolved before they ever reached the sprawling branches of the neem tree. Lakhan hummed. It was a tune without words, a melody his mother had sung decades ago while she ground spices with a stone mortar, a rhythm that now matched the gentle, percussive bubble sounds rising from the kettle's belly. His apron was already dusted with cardamom powder, white flecks stark against the dark indigo cotton. He wiped his hands absently across the fabric, leaving faint spice trails that mapped his movements like a topography of flavor. The steam thickened, heavy and fragrant, carrying the scent outward past the neem tree's rough bark, drifting toward the village lanes where the first visitor would eventually walk. He wondered, idly, if the scent would find Bapu before the man found the path. He tapped 2 fingers on the rim of the central kulhad, testing the clay. It was cool still, but warming, the earthy vessel beginning to hold the memory of the fire. He tilted his head slightly, listening. Not to the rain, not yet, but to the silence between the wind gusts, the hollow space where a footstep might land. The steam rose higher now, forming shapes that dissolved before they could be named, a hand reaching, a face in profile, a bird in flight. Lakhan watched them without trying to hold them. To name the shape would be to kill it. The chai would be ready when it was ready, the rain would fall when it fell. To force either was an insult to the process. He moved to the edge of the courtyard, peering down the lane where the dust still lay dry and pale. The path was empty, yet the scent of chai drifted outward, an invitation written in spice and steam that no wind could erase. He murmured, his voice low and rhythmic, the words lost in the gale but the meaning clear even to himself, patience. The chai needed time to marry the milk to the spice. The guests needed time to arrive. The rain needed time to gather its courage. Everything needed time, and Lakhan had learned, long ago, that time was the only thing worth waiting for. Everything else was just noise. Returning to the kettle, he stirred the brew with a wooden spoon, his movements slow and deliberate, as if moving through water. The milk swirled with the spices, turning the liquid to a rich amber brown, the color of wet earth after a long drought. The scent grew stronger, wrapping the courtyard in a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire beneath the stand. The steam rose in a steady column now, no longer flickering or dissolving into nothingness. Lakhan leaned against the sun-baked wall, wiping his apron once more, his eyes fixed on the lane where Bapu would appear. He adjusted the flame lower, sensing the brew was nearing its voice. He heard the footstep before he saw the shadow. It was soft, deliberate, the step of a man who had walked this path for 40 years and knew every loose stone by heart. Lakhan smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling into deep, familiar lines, and adjusted the flame to a gentle simmer. Bapu was coming. The chai would be ready. The courtyard would be full, even if only with the two of them in the gathering storm. The cardamom scent grew heavier, wrapping the courtyard in a warmth that seeped into the stones, the walls, the neem tree's rough bark, and the very air they breathed. Lakhan tapped a kulhad rim gently again. The clay was warm now, almost hot, vibrating with potential. He hummed a folk tune under his breath, swaying slightly to the rhythm of the rain that had not yet fallen. The steam curled around him like a soft invitation, and he wiped his hands on his apron, leaving the spice trails like a map of where he had been and where he intended to stay. The flame steadied, and the chai began to bubble softly, a sound like a cat purring in deep contentment. Lakhan glanced toward the neem tree, its leaves beginning to shiver, though the wind had dropped to a whisper, then back at the kettle. His hands rested on his apron, ready for the first pour. The courtyard was quiet, the scent of chai hanging in the air like a solemn promise. Bapu's shadow fell across the courtyard entrance, tall and familiar, stretching long across the dusty ground. Lakhan tilted his head, listening to the silence between the old man's footsteps. "Saber," Bapu said, the word landing as both a greeting and a benediction. Lakhan nodded, his hand still resting on the kulhad, feeling the warmth seep into his palm. "The chai is ready," he said, his voice low and steady, matching the simmer. "The rain will come soon." Bapu leaned against the neem tree trunk, stroking his white beard absently, his fingers tangling in the coarse hairs. He closed his eyes for a long moment, breathing in the scent of cardamom and cinnamon as if it were a meal in itself. When he opened them, they were bright with the knowing that had nothing to do with sight. "The rain is already here," he said, his voice rough and slow, worn smooth like a river stone. "It is in the steam, it is in the spice, it is in the waiting." Lakhan poured the chai into the kulhads, the liquid amber and fragrant, the steam rising in a gentle column that wrapped around their hands. He handed the first cup to Bapu, who took it with both hands, holding it close to his chest as though warming himself from the inside out. The old man sipped, closing his eyes again, and when he opened them they were bright with something that might have been tears, or perhaps just the reflection of the fire. "The chai matches the rain," Bapu said, his voice soft, almost lost beneath the rustle of the neem leaves. "It always does." Lakhan smiled, tapping the rim of his own kulhad with 2 fingers. The clay was warm, the chai was hot, and the rain was coming. He hummed the folk tune again, swaying slightly, and waited for the first drop to fall. The 40-year bench. Bapu was already on the stone bench before the first cloud broke. Not the first cloud of the evening, but the first cloud of the season. He had settled himself with a sigh that sounded less like exhaustion and more like an old man finding the exact right seam in a familiar chair, his spine curving against the rough bark of the neem trunk. One hand rested heavily on his knee, knuckles swollen like knots in an old rope. The other was already reaching for his beard, fingers tracing the white hairs as if they were a rosary he couldn't stop fingering. The bench was low, unglazed stone, the same slab that had held him through 40 monsoons. Over decades his weight had worn the rock into a shallow bowl, a topography of habit. He fit into it the way a river stone fits into the mud it has spent a lifetime smoothing, irreversible, inevitable. Lakhan saw him from the courtyard entrance, where he was arranging clay kulhads on the low wooden stand his father had carved before the wood itself had grayed with age. The kulhads were still cool, their surfaces rough and unburnished, waiting for the shock of boiling chai to wake them. He placed them in a tight circle, the way his mother had taught him, each rim touching the next so they wouldn't tip when the wind picked up. When he looked up and saw Bapu already claiming the bench, the words died in his throat. He didn't speak. He just tilted his head, listening to the silence between the old man's breathing and the distant rumble that wasn't thunder yet, but was clearly practicing. There was a weight to this quiet, a pressure that felt like a held breath. "The clouds," Bapu said, pointing a stiff finger toward the western horizon. The sky there had turned the color of wet slate, a gray so deep it seemed to hold water like a secret too heavy to keep. His voice was rough and slow, each word placed carefully on the dusty ground between them, as if he were laying bricks. They are the same color they were 40 years ago, the same gray, the same weight. Lakhan nodded, his hand still resting on a kulhad, feeling the clay's chill seep into his palm. He wiped his hands on his apron, leaving chalky dust trails that mapped exactly where he had been standing. Behind him, the brass kettle was already steaming, the fire banked low beneath it, waiting for the moment when the rain would justify turning up the flame. He moved closer to Bapu, lifting a kulhad from the stand and offering it empty. A gesture, not a drink. It was a question asked without words. "Are you ready?" Bapu waved it away with one hand, the fingers stiff with age but gentle in their refusal. "Not yet," he said, the corners of his mouth tightening. "The rain must come first. The chai must wait. The order is the order." He stroked his beard again, his eyes closing for a long moment, breathing in the scent of the wind. It carried dust from the ran, and something else, salt perhaps, or the memory of salt from years when the desert flooded and the white earth turned to a shallow, shimmering sea. 40 years ago, he murmured, opening his eyes, but not looking at Lakhan. His gaze remained fixed on the slate-colored horizon, unblinking. The rain came in sheets, not drops, sheets. The courtyard filled to the ankles. The neem tree drank until its roots sang. Lakhan listened, tapping 2 fingers absently on the rim of the empty kulhad he still held, checking its warmth, though he knew it was cold. He knew the story. He had heard it every monsoon since he was a boy, the cadence as familiar as the taste of cardamom. But he listened as if it were new, because to do otherwise would be to break the ritual. Bapu's voice wove images of salt desert floods, of women dancing in the deluge while the men sheltered the livestock, of old wells filling so fast they overflowed before anyone could reach them. The story was the ceremony itself, as vital as the chai would be. Bapu paused mid-sentence, his hand stilling on his beard. He opened his eyes fully now, watching the sky as if reading a text written in cloud formations, deciphering a language only he understood. The wind had dropped to a whisper, but the neem leaves were still shivering, trembling with an anticipation that felt electric. He stroked his beard once more, slowly, deliberately, then leaned back into the stone bench. His chuckle softened the heavy air, a low rumble like distant thunder promising relief. "The smell," he murmured, more to himself than to Lakhan. "The smell of the wind before the rain. It is the same smell my father smelled. The same smell his father smelled. It does not change." Lakhan glanced at the kettle, then at Bapu. The brass was beginning to whistle softly, a low, mournful note that matched the old man's breathing. He wiped his apron again, though his hands were clean, the motion a nervous habit rather than a need. His posture shifted, leaning slightly toward Bapu, his body bowing in quiet respect for the elder's ritual, the waiting, the watching, the absolute refusal to drink before the rain fell. This was the order. The chai came after the rain came after the waiting came after the story. To rush it would be to invite bad luck, or so the old ways said. Bapu shifted on the bench, settling deeper into the stone bowl his body had carved over 4 decades. He closed his eyes once more, his breathing syncing with the wind that carried the scent of distant rain. His presence anchored the courtyard in a profound calm, a still point in a turning world. The kulhads on the stand waited. The fire beneath the kettle waited. Lakhan waited, his hands steady on the spoon he used to stir chai that hadn't yet been poured, listening to Bapu's slow, rhythmic breathing and the distant thunder that was no longer practicing. It was arriving. The first drop landed on a neem leaf with a soft, definitive plink. Bapu's eyes opened, bright with something that might have been tears or might have been the reflection of the fire. He didn't move. He didn't reach for the kulhad. He just watched the drop slide down the leaf's spine and fall to the dusty ground, where it darkened the earth in a small, perfect circle. Lakhan watched too, his head tilted, listening to the sound of the rain beginning, not as weather, but as music. The tempo had changed. The pause was over. He reached for the kettle, and for the first time the flame answered. The first pattern. Lakhan lifted the brass kettle from the flame, the metal heavy and singing with residual heat, and tilted it over the row of unglazed kulhads lined along the wooden stand. Cardamom steam curled from his wrist, a fragrant ribbon rising past the low-hanging neem branches, and then the first drop of rain struck the hot stones of the courtyard. It hissed, a sharp, intimate sound, and sent up a wisp of white vapor that dissolved instantly into the damp evening air. He froze mid-pour, his hands suspended above the cups, head cocked to one side like a bird listening for a worm. Was that truly rain, or just the wind shaking a loose branch? He held his breath, straining against the silence of the courtyard, the wind through the neem leaves, and Bapu's slow, rhythmic breathing from the bench. One more drop. Then another. The rhythm arrived. Plink, plink, plink. Faster now, coalescing into something steady, a pattern that settled against the earth like a heartbeat finding its tempo. Lakhan's shoulders dropped, the tension bleeding out of his spine, and a small smile touched his lips. He resumed the pour with gentle care, filling each cup to the very rim without spilling a single drop. The chai bloomed the color of dark honey, thick with milk, the cracked cardamom pods floating on the surface like small, spice-laden boats drifting on a calm sea. Bapu opened his eyes. The first cool rain touched his weathered cheek, and he stroked his beard, the gray hairs coarse between his fingers. "Han," he murmured, a single syllable carrying the weight of decades of approval. His chuckle followed, low and rough, vibrating in his chest like distant thunder rolling across the salt desert. "The stones know when to sing," he said, shifting on the bench. His body settled into the groove he had worn into the wood over 40 years, a depression that fit him as perfectly as a prayer mat. Lakhan carried 2 kulhads across the courtyard, his fingers tapping gently against the porous clay to check their warmth before setting them down. He placed one before Bapu and one on the empty space beside him, then wiped his hands on his apron, the motion automatic, a nervous tick that belied his calm exterior. "Cardamom strong tonight," he said, his voice low, warmed by the steam rising between them. Bapu nodded, picking up the cup with both hands, cradling it as if it were something fragile, something holy. He brought it to his lips and sipped slowly, his eyes closing in a long, satisfied blink. "Shukriya," he murmured, the gratitude softening the gravel in his voice. The rain was no longer tentative. It was a backdrop, steady and sure. The stones had stopped hissing. They were singing. At the gate, a shadow detached itself from the deepening twilight. Wajiha Qureshi appeared, carrying a basket wrapped in a soft muslin cloth, the edges of her sari paloo damp and darkened by the rain. She paused at the threshold, and her eyes smiled before her mouth did, a habit that made every arrival feel less like a visit and more like a gift. "Salam," she said. Her voice was melodic, lilted, weaving Gujarati with soft Urdu phrases that sounded like a song played on a string instrument. Bhakri fresh, still warm from the oven. She adjusted the cloth covering her basket, her hands wiping gently on her sari paloo, her movements precise and unhurried. Lakhan tilted his head in greeting, wiping his apron again, though it was already dry, then gestured toward the bench with an open palm. "Ah-ow," he said simply. The word carried no urgency, only warmth. "Come. Sit. The rain is here." Wajiha stepped into the courtyard, the damp earth cool beneath her sandals. She set the basket near the bench, her smile finally reaching her mouth, crinkling the corners of her eyes. The rain drummed harder on the neem leaves now, a percussive thrum that seemed to amplify her presence, adding a layer of softness to the hard lines of the courtyard walls. Lakhan returned to the kettle, refilling the kulhads as they emptied, his humming matching the rain's rhythm. His apron was damp with steam now, clinging to his waist, and the courtyard smelled of wet earth, crushed cardamom, and the faint yeasty sweetness of bhakri. He glanced toward the lane, his mind tracing the invisible threads of the village. Fennel would come, he knew. Fennel always came when the rain found its tempo, drawn by the promise of rhythm. Wajiha unwrapped the bhakri, the cloth layers peeling back to reveal the bread, golden and soft, still radiating heat from her oven. She placed one on a small earthen plate and passed it to Bapu, who took it with a solemn nod, breaking off a piece and dipping it into his chai. The courtyard filled with the quiet sounds of eating, of breathing, of rain drumming on the leaves, a symphony of domestic peace. And Lakhan, pouring chai, humming under his breath, watching the rain fall on the salt desert beyond the courtyard wall, felt a thought crystallize. This is what my mother meant. The chai tasted different when the rain arrived on schedule. Not because the cardamom changed, not because the milk was sweeter, but because the waiting had ended. The pause was over. He glanced at the carved stand his father had made, the wood dark with age, the grooves worn smooth by decades of kulhads resting there. He tapped 2 fingers on the rim of an empty cup, checking its warmth, and felt something settle in his chest. Not relief, not joy, but the quiet certainty that the ritual was intact. The order held. The rain came after the waiting. The chai came after the rain. And the waiting, he realized, was not empty. It was the whole point. He looked toward the lane again, the darkness thick and wet. Ishani, perhaps, would arrive next, with her notebook tucked under one arm, tucking hair behind her ear, tracing the rim of a kulhad with a distracted finger. Or Fanil, with his tabla wrapped in cloth, adjusting the drums with careful precision, playing so softly the music would become almost part of the rain itself. The night was young, the monsoon just beginning its long conversation with the earth, and the courtyard was already full of the sounds that made a village feel like home. But there was a silence beneath the noise, a space where someone else was expected, someone whose arrival would change the rhythm entirely. Lakhan wiped his hands one last time and waited. The three-layered warmth. Wajiha's hands moved in layers, peeling back the cloth like someone opening a letter written in fabric. The first wrap was a square of faded blue cotton, the kind that had seen 100 washes and still held the ghost of indigo. Under it lay a second layer, thinner, a muslin the color of unbleached wheat. And beneath that, the third, a scrap of old sari, soft as skin, smelling faintly of the oven that had baked the bread inside her home 3 lanes over. The bhakri itself exhaled when the last cloth fell away. Steam rose in a thin, lazy column, meeting the damp air of the courtyard and dissolving almost immediately, but the warmth remained, a dry, yeasty heat that carried the smell of cumin and the char of the clay tawa. Wajiha wiped her hands on the pallu of her sari, a gesture so habitual it looked like part of the unwrapping itself. She placed the bread on a small earthen plate, the kind with the rough rim that Lakhan's father used to sell before the pottery business narrowed to kulhads and nothing else. 3 layers, she said, her voice carrying that slight cadence that made even mundane observations sound like a melody. The first keeps the dust, the second keeps the damp. The third... She paused, adjusting the cloth covering the empty basket beside her. The third keeps the warmth. Bapu's chuckle came low and slow, the sound of distant thunder rolling across the ran. He had been watching her hands with the focused attention he gave to anything that involved patience. Now he reached for the bhakri, his fingers rough and deliberate, breaking off a piece with a quiet crackle of crust. Steam curled from the interior, catching the dim light of the single bulb strung under the neem tree. The third keeps the warmth, Bapu repeated, as if tasting the words along with the bread. He dipped the piece into his kulhad of chai, watching the milk darken at the edges. 40 years I've been eating your bhakri, Wajiha, and every monsoon I forget how good it is. Wajiha's smile reached her eyes before her mouth caught up, the way it always did. She settled onto the low stool she'd brought with her, adjusting the basket's cloth covering with one hand while the other rested on her knee. The oven is hot today, she said softly, hotter than yesterday. The rain makes the fire burn different. Lakhan listened, his head tilted slightly, the gesture so small it might have been missed if anyone wasn't watching. He poured another round of chai into the kulhads, the stream precise and steady, and set the kettle down on the carved stand his father had made. The wood was dark with age, the grooves worn smooth by decades of resting cups. He tapped 2 fingers on the rim of an empty kulhad, checking its warmth, then turned his attention back to the bread. He broke the bhakri himself, splitting it into quarters, passing one to Bapu and keeping one for himself. The steam rose between them, brief and honest. Lakhan bit into his piece slowly, letting the warmth spread through his mouth before he chewed. The bread was soft but firm, the kind that required patience to eat properly. He hummed under his breath, a low rhythm that matched the rain drumming on the neem leaves above. The lane beyond the courtyard gate was empty, but Lakhan glanced toward it anyway, his eyes scanning the wet darkness. Ishani would come. She always came when the rain found its tempo, drawn by the promise of stories. He wiped his hands on his apron, the fabric already damp, and waited. She appeared at the gate not with a flourish, but with a quiet certainty, her notebook already open in one hand, the pages threatened by the rain. Ishani Bhavsar tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with her free hand, her eyes scanning the courtyard as if mapping it for the first time. She stepped inside without asking, the way someone enters a place they've entered 100 times before. The rain came faster than I expected, she said, her voice soft and precise, each word placed with care. She closed the gate behind her with one hand, shielding her notebook with the other. Lakhan nodded, slow and warm, his movements deliberate. He gestured toward the stone bench where Bapu sat, then toward the empty stool beside Wajiha. "Sit," he said, his voice low, ending with that soft exhale that sounded like steam escaping a kettle. "The bench is dry." Ishani sat, placing her notebook open on her lap. She traced the rim of a kulhad with one finger, her pen hovering above the page without touching it. The bread steam rose around her, carrying the smell of cumin and warmth. She studied the bhakri on the earthen plate, then at Wajiha, who was already offering her a piece. "Fresh," Wajiha said, holding the bread out. "Still warm." Ishani accepted with a soft nod, her pen pausing mid-air. She bit into the bhakri slowly, her eyes on the bread, her expression absorbed. "The third layer," she said after a moment, her voice quiet. "That's the secret, isn't it?" Wajiha's eyes crinkled. "The third keeps the warmth." Bapu broke another piece of bhakri, his rough voice murmuring something about the taste, though the words were lost under the rain. He stroked his white beard absently, leaning back against the neem tree trunk, his eyes half closed in contentment. The bread was good, the chai was good, the rain was good. There was nothing else to say. Lakhan refilled the kulhads from the kettle, steam curling around him in thin ribbons. He wiped his hands on his apron again, the gesture automatic, and sat back on his heels, watching the group share bread and chai. His humming was soft and steady, a rhythm that matched the rain, that matched the drumming on the neem leaves, that matched the quiet sounds of eating and breathing and being together. Ishani traced the rim of her kulhad with one finger, her notebook open but unused. The page was blank except for a single line written earlier, in the dry hour before the rain. "The third layer keeps the warmth." She hadn't written it yet. She was still deciding whether the line was true. Lakhan tilted his head, listening to the rain. The monsoon had settled into its rhythm now, steady and unhurried, the drops falling in a tempo that matched the slow breathing of the courtyard. His apron was damp, his hands were warm, and the kulhads were full. The night was young, the rain was just beginning, and the bread was still warm beneath the third layer of cloth. The hovering pen. The pen hovered above the page, a black dot forming where Ishani's hand had stalled. 3 lines of the old woman's story about the salt traders sat unfinished, the ink pooling like a tiny lake on the rough paper. She lifted the pen, set it down, lifted it again. The rain had taken the thread. She read aloud anyway, her voice soft and precise, each word placed carefully between the drumming on the neem leaves. And the trader walked for 7 days across the white plain, carrying nothing but a sack of cumin and a map drawn on his wife's saree. She paused. A loose strand of hair had fallen across her cheek, and she tucked it behind her ear with a quick, practiced motion. When she looked back at the page, the sentence had slipped away. The trader, the cumin, the saree, all of it had dissolved into the sound of water hitting stone. Ishani traced the rim of her kulhad with one finger, the clay cool against her skin. Her eyes drifted past the notebook, past the courtyard, past the rain, to some place the story had wanted to take her before the weather interrupted. The pen hovered again. The page waited. She was still deciding whether the line was true. Lakhan watched her from behind the kettle. He tilted his head, listening not to the rain, but to the silence inside Ishani's pause. His apron was damp from hours of wiping. He wiped his hands again now, the gesture automatic, a reflex that had nothing to do with wetness and everything to do with the rhythm of caring for other people. He picked up the kettle and crossed the courtyard, his steps slow on the wet stones. Steam curled around him as he poured, the chai dark and fragrant, cardamom and cinnamon rising in thin ribbons. He set the kulhad back in front of Ishani without a word, his humming low and steady, matching the tempo of the rain. The steam wrapped around her hands. She didn't drink. Not yet. The gate creaked. Not loudly, just enough for Lakhan to look up, for Bapu's eyes to open, for Wajiha's hands to still on the cloth covering her basket. Fanil Khatri stood in the archway, rain running off the brim of his hat, his tabla case held against his chest like something fragile. He stepped inside with careful precision, each foot placed deliberately on the dry patches of stone. He carried the instrument the way a man carries a child, close, protected, aware of its weight. Fanil set the tabla down near the trough, adjusting the position of the drums with small, measured movements. The bayan sat slightly left of center, the dayan angled just so, the leather straps arranged in parallel lines. He knelt beside them and tapped his fingers on his knee, his eyes on the trough where the rain collected in a shallow pool. He was thinking about which rag suited this particular evening, not the monsoon rag he played every year, not the predictable choice, but something that matched the weight of this rain, the particular quiet of this courtyard, the exact shade of green. The neem leaves had turned under the deluge. The right rag would sound like the rain remembering something it had almost forgotten. Lakhan nodded to Fanil, his humming pausing for one beat, a small silence that said, "You are welcome here." He wiped his hands once more on his apron, though they were already dry, and gestured toward the stone bench beside Bapu. The movement was slow, unhurried, the gesture of a man who had all night and no reason to rush. Fanil understood. He understood that the invitation was not to perform, but to join. Finiel sat on the bench, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the rain. He placed his fingertips on the skin of the dion, barely touching, feeling the tension of the leather, the temperature of the drum. Then he played. The first beat was so soft it might have been another raindrop. The second followed, a whisper of sound, a pulse that belonged to neither the instrument nor the weather but to the space between them. His fingertips barely disturbed the drum skin, the sound rising like breath rather than striking like a hand. The tabla's rhythm wove through the rain strip, through the rustle of neem leaves, through the low hum that Lakhan had resumed, threading itself into the evening like a new voice in an old song. Ishani stopped reading. She didn't decide to stop. The decision was made for her by something deeper than thought. Her pen rested on the page, her notebook closed gently, the cover folding over the unfinished story like a lid over a pot. Her eyes moved to Finiel, watching his hands, watching the way his shoulders swayed, watching the concentration that sat on his face like a second skin. She wasn't surrendering the story, she was letting the music carry it. Bapu stroked his white beard, his rough voice murmuring something that might have been approval or might have been a memory of another evening, another musician, another rain. He leaned back against the neem tree trunk, the bark rough against his spine, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, each exhale sinking with the space between Finiel's beats. The old man had heard 1,000 rains and 1,000 tablas, and tonight they were the same sound. Wajiha smiled with her eyes first, the warmth reaching them before her mouth caught up. She adjusted the cloth on her empty basket, folding the edges neatly, her fingers moving with the same care she used to wrap the bhakri. Her voice, when she spoke, was melodic, a soft Urdu phrase that might have been shukriya or might have been something older, something that belonged to the music rather than the language. She didn't say much, she didn't need to. The bhakri was gone, the basket was empty, and the warmth she had brought was now inside the chai and inside the bread and inside the quiet that sat between the rain and the tabla. Finiel played on, his tempo shifting with the rain's own changes, accelerating when the drops grew heavy, slowing when the clouds paused. He swayed slightly, his body moving with the music he was making, his eyes half closed, his fingers tracing patterns on the drum skin that belonged to a language older than words. The courtyard held its breath. The kulhads sat full and steaming. The bhakri was warm beneath the third layer of cloth. The rain kept falling, and the tabla kept answering, and the night stretched out in front of them like a road that had no ending. Lakhan tilted his head again, listening to the new rhythm. The rain, the tabla, the breathing of the group, the soft hum that came from his own throat without his permission. He wiped his hands on his apron one final time and sat back on his heels, watching Finiel's fingers move, watching Ishani's eyes follow them, watching Bapu's chest rise and fall in time with the beats. The courtyard was full. The night was young. The chai was hot. Somewhere beyond the gate, beyond the rain, beyond the village of Nirona, a road stretched toward Bujai and beyond, toward Ahmedabad, and beyond that, toward cities where the rain fell differently and the music sounded different and the stories were told in different voices. But here, in this courtyard, under this neem tree, the story was this one: the rain, the tabla, the chai, the bread, the silence between the beats, the pen resting on the page, waiting for the music to finish before it would write again. Leto, the amber glow. The wick in the third lamp refused to catch. It hissed once, curled black at the tip, then lay flat again in its brass holder like a tired tongue. Lakhan leaned close, cupping his palm around the match flame, and blew, not hard, just a slow, patient exhale, the way he might have breathed onto a cold kulhad to warm it. The cotton fibers glowed orange, then amber, then a steady, trembling yellow. He straightened, wiping his hands once across the front of his apron, and moved to the next lamp. The courtyard had been washed clean by the rain. Every stone in the floor held a small dark mirror now, and as Lakhan lit each lamp in its turn, brass holder, wick soaked in mustard oil, flame coaxing itself upward, the amber glow doubled itself in the wet surface below. It made the whole space look deeper than it was, as if the ground had opened into another courtyard beneath, identical and inverted. Bapu noticed it first. He had been watching the sky through the neem branches, his beard stroked absently with one hand, but when the third lamp caught, he shifted his gaze downward and let out a low sound that might have been approval. "Jotno rang," Bapu murmured. "Light's color. Like old brass in a temple." Lakhan didn't answer. He moved to the fourth lamp, the one nearest Finiel's stool, and crouched beside it. The potter's tabla drums sat on the ground between Finiel's knees, their black skins gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Finiel had been tuning them since before the rain started, tapping the bass drum with 2 fingers and pressing the smaller drum against his thigh to test its pitch. Now, with the lamps lit, he stopped tuning and placed both hands flat on the skins. He closed his eyes. The rain had settled into a steady, even drumming on the neem leaves above them, 1,000 tiny fingertips tapping a rhythm that Finial seemed to be counting. His first beat came softly, almost apologetically. The right hand touched the smaller drum and produced a thin, clear tone that hung in the air for a moment before the rain swallowed it. Then the left hand pressed the larger drum and gave a deeper sound, a hollow thump that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Lakhan, still crouching by the lamp, tilted his head. He was listening, not just to the tabla, but to the space between the beats, the way the rain filled it, the way the silence after each beat was different from the silence before. "Tempo is slow tonight," Finial said, his voice quiet and measured. "The rain wants a ra'ag in Vilambit. Slow, like walking through water." Ishani had her notebook open on her lap, but her pen lay still across the page. She wasn't writing. She was watching the lamps. There were 6 of them now, arranged in a rough circle around the courtyard, 1 by the gate, 2 along the western wall, 1 near the neem tree where Bapu sat, 1 beside Finial, and the last one Lakhan had placed on the low stone ledge where he brewed chai. Each flame cast its own small circle of light, and where the circles overlapped, the brightness deepened to a rich honeyed gold. Ishani traced the rim of her kulhad with 1 finger, her eyes moving from flame to flame, absorbing the scene the way she might have absorbed a story. Wajiha sat with her basket beside her, the cloth covering it adjusted and smoothed until not a single wrinkle showed. She had arrived with fresh bhakri just as the rain began, and now the bread sat wrapped in 3 layers of cotton, still warm. She wiped her hands on her sari palu, not because they were dirty, but because the motion seemed to belong to the evening, to the ritual of settling in. Her smile reached her eyes before her mouth caught up, as it always did. "These lamps," she said, her voice carrying that slight cadence that made even ordinary words sound like a song. "They make the courtyard feel like a room, like the rain is outside and we are inside, even though there is no roof." Bapu chuckled, the sound like distant thunder. He leaned back against the neem trunk, the bark rough against his spine, and closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, he was looking at Lakhan, who had finished his circuit of the lamps and was now standing by the kettle, stirring the chai with a slow, deliberate motion. "Boy," Bapu said, using the affectionate term he reserved for Lakhan. "You arrange these lamps like you arrange your kulhads, 1 by 1, with patience. No hurry." Lakhan wiped his apron again, habit, not necessity, and nodded. He hummed then, a soft sound in his throat, matching the rhythm of Finial's tabla. It wasn't a tune anyone would recognize. It was something older, something that belonged to the evening, to the rain, to the amber glow reflecting in the wet stones. Finial's rag deepened. He had moved past the opening phrases into something richer, more complex. His fingers moved with precision across the drum skins, each beat landing exactly where he intended, each pause exactly the length he intended. He swayed slightly as he played, his body moving with the music he was making. Between beats, he tapped his fingers on his knee, a quiet, restless motion that suggested he was counting something only he could hear. "The trough," Finial said suddenly, his eyes opening. "Listen, the drip into the trough. It matches the bass drum, every 3rd drop." Lakhan tilted his head again, listening. He could hear it now, the rhythmic plip-plip-plip of water falling from the neem branches into the old stone trough beside the wall. 3 drops, then a gap. 3 drops, then a silence. Finial's left hand on the bass drum landed on each group of 3, anchoring the rhythm, grounding it in the physical world. Ishani finally picked up her pen. She didn't write. She just held it, poised above the page, her eyes on Finial's hands. Bapu stroked his beard and said nothing. Wajiha adjusted the cloth on her basket one more time and settled into the warmth of the lamps. The rain steadied. It was no longer falling in fits and starts, no longer pausing between bursts. It drummed on the neem leaves with a constant, even pressure, a sound that wrapped around the courtyard like a second roof. The amber glow of the lamps deepened as the night grew darker, and the reflections in the wet stones grew brighter, until the courtyard seemed to float in a pool of golden light. Lakhan stirred the chai one final time and sat back on his heels beside the kettle. He watched the lamps. He listened to the tabla. He let his humming match Finial's rhythm, let his breathing match the rain. His apron was damp where the rain had caught him lighting the lamps, but he didn't notice. He had surrendered to the evening's rhythm, the way he always did when the monsoon arrived and the courtyard filled with light and music and the quiet companionship of people who needed nothing more than to sit together and wait for the rain to stop. Vanille's rag wove through the rain now, inseparable from it. The tabla was no longer a separate sound. It was part of the evening's texture, like the amber glow, like the steam rising from the chai, like the warmth of the bhakri beneath Wajiha's cloth. Lakhan closed his eyes briefly, tilting his head to listen, and when he opened them again, he was looking at Ishani, who had finally begun to write. "Tomorrow," Ishani said softly, her pen moving across the page, "I will write the story of the lamps." The second pour. The kettle exhaled its final shuddering hiss, the cardamom spirit spent and sinking to the bottom of the pot like a dormant seed. Before the silence could fully settle, before the rain could claim the courtyard entirely, Lakhan reached for the tin of dried ginger. His fingers, rough from years of handling clay and flame, found the coarse slices instantly. He didn't rush. There was no need to rush when the monsoon held the world in a suspended breath. He waited, patient as the neem tree outside, for the water to find its gentle boil once more, wiping his hands on the thick cotton of his apron, the fabric already damp with the humidity that seeped through the open workshop walls. The dried ginger hit the water with a soft, wet slap, and immediately the air shifted. It wasn't the sweet floral comfort of cardamom anymore. This was sharper, earthier, a pungent warmth that clawed at the growing chill drifting in from the salt desert. The scent rose with the steam, heavy and golden, layering itself over the familiar spices, until the entire courtyard smelled of old medicine and deep roots. Lakhan tilted his head, his ear catching the changing cadence of the rain. It had intensified, drumming harder against the broad leaves of the neem, 1,000 tiny hammers striking green anvils. A low hum vibrated in his throat, soft and steady, a wordless melody that matched the rhythm of the falling water. In the corner, Bapu shifted on his woven charpoy, the wood creaking under the weight of his memories. He opened his mouth, and a story began to form, not with a shout, but with a rumble that started deep in his chest, low and resonant, like distant thunder rolling across the ran. "The year the sky broke open," Bapu murmured, his eyes already closing, surrendering to the sensory trigger of the storm. 94. The water didn't fall, it hammered. It turned the white earth into a black mirror, just like tonight. Lakhan watched the elder, recognizing the faraway look in Bapu's closed eyes. He knew this story, had heard it a dozen times, yet he poured with the reverence of the first telling. The ginger chai was ready. He lifted the heavy kettle, the steam curling around his forearms like a living thing, wrapping him in a hazy halo. With movements slow and deliberate, born of a lifetime of practice, he tilted the stream into the waiting kulhads. The clay cups absorbed the heat instantly, their unglazed surfaces darkening as the liquid filled them to the brim. "Warmth for the bones," Lakhan said, his voice low and rhythmic, a counterpoint to Bapu's storytelling drone. He carried the first cup to Wajiha. She accepted the kulhad with both hands, her fingers curling around the hot clay, drawing the heat into her palms. A smile broke across her face, genuine and unguarded, reaching all the way to her eyes, crinkling the corners until she looked years younger. "You always know when the chill bites," she said, her voice melodic, weaving through the sound of the rain. She brought the cup to her lips and sipped slowly, closing her eyes for a heartbeat as the ginger burned pleasantly down her throat. There was a profound comfort in the ritual, a shared silence that spoke louder than words, a recognition that in this courtyard they were anchored against the storm. Beside her, Ishani traced the rim of her untouched kulhad with a single finger, feeling the rough texture of the clay beneath her nail. She listened to Bapu's monsoon tale, her notebook closed tight on her lap, the pen resting across the cover like a dormant bridge. She didn't write. Tonight, the story didn't belong in ink, it belonged in the air, in the space between the raindrops. Her eyes remained fixed on the elder, studying the way his weathered face relaxed into the narrative, the deep lines around his mouth softening. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and precise, cutting through the atmospheric hum. "The drainage in the lower village, did it hold that year, Bapu? Or did the salt pan swallow the road again?" Bapu paused, the question hanging in the humid air. He stroked his beard, the gray bristles coarse between his calloused fingers, buying time to navigate the memory. He opened his eyes, blinking against the dim light of the oil lamp, and looked out at the curtain of rain. A chuckle rumbled in his throat, soft like the thunder he had mimicked moments before. "The road vanished," he said, weaving the silence back into the tale with the skill of a weaver mending a tear. But the people did not. We walked on the roofs, we floated on the doors. The water took the ground, but it could not take the village. From the other side of the courtyard, Vanille's tabla answered. He didn't speak, he simply let his fingertips find the skin of the drums. The beats were sparse at first, tentative, matching the rain's cadence drop for drop. Then, as Bapu's voice gained traction, Vanille's rhythm deepened. He swayed slightly, his spine curving with the music, his fingertips barely touching the drumskin, coaxing a resonance that wove through the elders' rough tales. The tabla became the heartbeat of the story, the dayan providing the sharp crack of lightning, the bayan the low, rolling growl of the storm. It wasn't accompaniment, it was conversation. Lakhan watched them all, the circle of light in the encroaching dark. He wiped his apron one more time, a habitual gesture, then sat back on his heels, his posture relaxed but alert. His gaze drifted past the courtyard wall, past the dripping eaves, to the vast expanse of the salt desert beyond the village. The white ground, usually blinding in the sun, had turned to a dark obsidian mirror under the downpour, reflecting the flickering oil lamp and the silhouette of the neem tree. It looked as though the earth had been polished by the sky, slick and infinite. "The ginger is good," Wajiha said, breaking the spell of the story for a moment. She held her cup up slightly, a toast to the brewer. "It cuts through the damp better than the cardamom." "Cardamom is for the morning," Lakhan replied, his hands resting placidly on his apron. "Ginger is for when the rain tries to enter the blood. It keeps the chill out." Ishani finally lifted her cup, taking a small, testing sip. The heat was fierce, the ginger biting and bright, waking senses she hadn't realized were dull. She set the cup down carefully, her expression thoughtful. "It tastes like survival," she noted, the precision of her observation surprising even herself. Bapu nodded, his eyes drifting shut again as he neared the crescendo of his tale. "Survival," he echoed, the word heavy with history. "And stubbornness. The salt farmers are stubborn. The rain knows this. That is why it keeps coming back. To test us." Vanille's drumming shifted, the tempo quickening just slightly, mirroring the rising intensity of the downpour. The rain drummed harder on the neem leaves now, a frenzied applause for the old man's words. Lakhan tilted his head again, listening to the interplay of water and wood, of voice and drum. He hummed softly, the sound barely audible, a thread of melody that bound the group together. His presence was calm, watchful, the quiet center around which the storm and the story orbited. As the second pour settled into their hands and their bones, the courtyard felt less like a shelter from the rain and more like a vessel filled by it. The ginger chai warmed the guests from within, fighting the encroaching damp, while Bapu's voice and Vanille's drums fought the silence from without. Lakhan watched the dark mirror of the salt desert, seeing not just the reflection of the lamp, but the reflection of 100 storms survived, waiting for the next chapter of the rain to begin. The surrendering Rag. Vanille's fingers stopped, not because the Rag ended, but because the rain had stolen the beat. The downpour had shifted in the last quarter hour, thickening from a steady drumming into something with weight and intention. It hammered the neem leaves now, a percussive roar that swallowed the courtyard whole. Vanille's tabla, usually a thread weaving through the ambient noise, had been buried beneath it. He lifted his hands from the drumskins and let them hover there, palms open, listening. "The rain has taken the toll," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a musician's certainty. "It's playing the theka now. I'm just the melody on top." Lakhan tilted his head, the gesture so habitual it looked like a reflex. He listened past Vanille's words to the sound itself. The rain on the neem was no longer random. It had found a rhythm, a cyclic pattern that matched the monsoon's ancient tempo. The drops fell in groups of 4, then 8, then 16, the way a tabla player builds a composition from a simple beat. Vanille nodded, his eyes on the metal tang trough beneath the neem. Water cascaded into it now, filling the vessel with a sound that was both percussion and bass. He adjusted his posture, sitting straighter, and began to play again. But this time, his strokes were slower, more deliberate. He wasn't leading the rhythm anymore, he was following it. His fingertips traced the rain's pattern, adding ornamentation to the downpour's steady thika. The rag he chose was something Lakhan had never heard before, not in Jamnagar, not in any courtyard during any monsoon. It was a surrendering rag, one that acknowledged the storm's dominance and wove a melody of acceptance around it. Ishani's pen stopped moving. She had been writing steadily, capturing Bapu's story about the salt traders, but now her hand rested on the page, the ink drying before she could complete a sentence. She looked up from her notebook, her eyes finding Vanille's hands on the tabla. The music had changed. It was no longer a performance, it was a conversation with the rain. She closed her notebook slowly, the cover whispering against the paper, and set it aside on the stone bench. Her fingers traced the rim of her kulhad, the clay warm beneath her touch, and she let her eyes drift shut for a moment. The ginger chai had warmed her from within, and the rain's rhythm was pulling her toward something deeper than wakefulness. Bapu leaned back against the neem trunk, his white beard catching the lamplight in silver strands. He stroked it absently, the motion syncing with his breathing, which had slowed to match the rain's cadence. His eyes closed, not in sleep, but in a kind of listening that went beyond sound. He had sat under this tree for 40 monsoons, and he knew the language of the rain better than any story he could tell. The old man murmured something, a phrase in Gujarati that Lakhan caught but didn't translate, a blessing perhaps, or a memory. His voice was rough and soft, the gravel of age smoothed by decades of patience. Wajiha adjusted her sari palu, the cloth slipping from her shoulder as she shifted on the bench. Her basket sat empty beside her, the bhakri distributed, the cloth wrapping torn and discarded. She watched the rain with a smile that began in her eyes before her mouth caught up, the expression so gentle it looked like a benediction. Her hands rested in her lap, no longer busy with dough or cloth, and she hummed a lullaby under her breath, the melody blending with Feniel's tabla and the rain's percussion. The song was something her mother had sung, something that belonged to the monsoon evenings of her childhood, and it carried a warmth that had nothing to do with the ginger chai. Lakhan sat back on his heels, his apron stained with chai spills and raindrops. His hands rested on his knees, palms up, as if receiving the evening. He watched the salt desert beyond the courtyard wall, the white ground transformed into a dark mirror by the downpour. The reflection of the oil lamp shimmered on the wet earth, a single point of amber in the obsidian expanse. The neem tree's silhouette was a black cutout against the rain-washed sky, its branches swaying in a rhythm that matched Feniel's slowing beats. The rain softened, not in volume, but in texture. The hammering became a whisper, the drops falling with a gentleness that suggested the storm was tired, or satisfied, or simply ready to let the night take over. Feniel's tabla slowed to match, each beat separated by a longer pause, the music thinning until it was barely more than a suggestion of rhythm. His eyes remained on the metal tang trough, his body swaying slightly with the last echoes of the rag. Ishani's head bowed forward, her chin resting on her chest, her breathing deep and even. The notebook lay forgotten on the bench beside her, the pages filled with fragments of Bapu's story, the pen capped and still. Wajiha's humming faded, the lullaby dissolving into the rain's drip. Bapu's murmuring stopped, his beard rising and falling with his sleep-soft breaths. Feniel's final beat hung in the air for a moment, then dissolved into the sound of water trickling into the trough. His hands fell to his lap, his shoulders relaxing, his eyes closing. The rain continued, but it was no longer a performance. It was just rain, falling steadily on the neem leaves, on the salt desert, on the clay tiles of the courtyard. The oil lamp guttered, the flame dipping low, casting long shadows that moved with the wind. Lakhan's eyes closed briefly, not in sleep, but in a contentment that was almost prayer. He listened to the drip of the rain into the trough, counting the drops the way a potter counts the rotations of the wheel. Each one was a moment, a beat, a breath. The courtyard was still, the guests surrendered to the monsoon's rhythm, and the night stretched ahead, deep and quiet and full of rain. Somewhere beyond the village, beyond the salt desert, the storm was moving east, toward the Gulf of Kutch. The clouds would break by dawn, and the first light would find the earth polished and dark, reflecting the sky like a mirror held up to the sun. But for now, there was only the rain, and the trough, and the slow counting of drops into stillness. Drip into dreams. Lakhan sat with his eyes half closed, counting the drips falling into the metal trough. Each one landed with a soft plink, a rhythm that matched the slow rise and fall of Ishani's breathing. She had curled into herself like a question mark, her notebook still open on her lap, the pen capped and resting against a page filled with fragments of Bapu's story about the salt trader. The oil lamp beside her sputtered, casting shadows that moved across the courtyard stones like slow tide. He rose without sound, his feet finding the familiar path between the sleeping forms. His hands found the edge of his apron and wiped themselves automatically, though they held nothing but air. The apron was damp from hours of work, steam from the chai, rain from the courtyard, the condensation of a night that had breathed against every surface. The draft came first as a whisper against the back of his neck. Lakhan paused, his head tilting slightly as he listened to the wind moving through the neem branches above. It carried the scent of wet earth and something older. the smell of salt from the rain, traveling on a current that had crossed miles of desert to reach this courtyard. The rain had softened to a fine mist, no longer hammering but drifting, each drop falling with the patience of a potter shaping clay. Ishani shivered in her sleep, her shoulders rising and falling with the movement. Lakhan reached for the spare shawl folded on the bench behind him, a thick woolen thing, dyed indigo, smelling of lavender and sun. He unfolded it slowly, his movements deliberate, and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric settled around her like a second skin, and she sighed without waking, her body accepting the warmth as naturally as the earth accepts rain. Finiel's tabla had slowed to a whisper minutes ago. Now it stopped entirely. His hands rested on the drums, his fingers curled slightly inward, the calluses on his fingertips dark against the pale skin of the instrument. The tabla sat beside him like a sleeping animal, its surface still warm from hours of rhythm. Lakhan watched him for a moment, noting the way Finiel's chest rose and fell in time with the rain. The musician had played until his body surrendered to the night, his rhythm dissolving into the drip of water into the trough. Bapu slept against the neem tree, his white beard spread across his chest like a fan. His breathing was deep and even, each exhale carrying the soft chuckle that ended his stories even in sleep. Lakhan tilted his head, listening. The old man's breath synced with the rain, a duet that had played for 40 monsoons. Bapu refused to move indoors, even when the rain grew heavy, insisting the courtyard was the best place to watch the sky. Now the sky watched back, the clouds parting slowly, revealing stars that had waited all evening to appear. Wajiha lay on the stone bench, her basket empty beside her. The bhakri had been unwrapped and eaten hours ago, the paper lining torn and scattered like fallen leaves. Her sari pallu was draped across her lap, one hand resting on the cloth as if still adjusting it. Lakhan moved toward her, his shadow falling across the bench. He lifted the edge of her shawl, a thin cotton thing patterned with small flowers, and tucked it more securely around her shoulders. Her breathing deepened, her body settling into the stone as if it were a bed. The last lamp flickered, its flame dipping low. Lakhan moved to trim the wick, his hands steady despite the hour. The scissors were old, their blades dulled from years of use, but they cut cleanly through the blackened cotton. The flame rose again, brighter for a moment, then steadied into a soft glow. Lakhan hummed under his breath, a tune without words, something his mother had sung while she brewed chai in the early hours before dawn. The sound was barely audible, a vibration more than a song, but it filled the courtyard with warmth. He sat back on his haunches, watching the rain soften to a whisper. The drip into the trough slowed to a single drop every few seconds, each one landing with a precision that felt intentional. Lakhan tapped 2 fingers gently on the rim of a kulhad, checking its warmth. The clay was cool now, the chai long gone, but the cup held the memory of heat like a potter holds the memory of fire. The courtyard was a map of surrendered bodies. Ishani curled beneath her shawl, her notebook still open. Finiel slumped beside his tabla, his hands relaxed. Bapu leaned against the neem, his beard rising and falling. Wajiha slept on the bench, her basket empty. Each one had found their own rhythm of sleep, their own negotiation with the night. Lakhan closed his eyes. His hands rested on his apron, his body surrendering to the rain-soaked slumber that had claimed the others. The steam of chai had faded hours ago, the warmth of the cups dispersed into the cool night air. But the courtyard held the memory of it, the scent of cardamom lingering in the damp stones, the taste of cinnamon clinging to the rim of a kulhad. The final lamp flickered and dimmed. The only sound was the rhythmic drip into the trough, each drop falling with the patience of a clock counting toward dawn. Lakhan's breathing synced with the rain, his body rising and falling in time with the night. The courtyard rested in peace, wrapped in the gentle dark of monsoon night. The village lulled into a dreamless slumber. Somewhere beyond Nirona, the storm moved east toward the Gulf of Kutch. The clouds would break by dawn, and the first light would find the earth polished and dark, reflecting the sky like a mirror held up to the sun. But for now, there was only the rain, and the trough, and the slow counting of drops into stillness. Lakhan slept, his hands resting on his apron, his body part of the courtyard, his breath part of the rain.